If you have your Bibles or your electronic devices, we're going to be in Romans 8 today. A week ago on Thursday, I've got a good friend. He's been very successful in life, and he's one of the most generous, big-hearted people I know. And he really has a soft place in his heart for homeless people, for less fortunate people. And last Thursday, he was out and about, and he ran across one of his homeless friends, and the homeless friend was named James. As was his typical habit, he would greet this homeless person by name, visit with him, express interest, and then reach in his pocket and pull out however much cash he had and give it to him. Well, this particular Thursday evening, he'd had a visit with James and he gave him some money, and James says, "Why do you do this?" And he said, "Well, I was really blessed today, and I just wanted to bless somebody else and do something nice for somebody." And James said, "Well, gosh, thank you so much." Last Monday, same friend. He's coming back to his building. He's been shopping at Whole Foods. He's got his bag of groceries, and he's about to his building, and he hears a commotion behind him. He hears footsteps running. He hears somebody yelling. And the somebody is yelling, "My turn, my turn, my turn." And he turns, and it's his homeless friend, James, who's running up to him. He's holding his pants up because he doesn't have a belt. He's got pants, but he doesn't have a belt because he's a homeless guy. And they'll fall down if he doesn't hold them up. So he's running, he's holding his pants up. He's got this $20 bill. He throws it in my friend's grocery bag and steps back so the friend wouldn't have time to take it out and give it back to him, which would be his natural tendency. And James just departs smiling so big and laughing, saying, "It's my turn, it's my turn, it's my turn." He was able to give back. Last week, we spent a lot of time, and the week before, talking about how so many Christians have a relationship with God that's based on fear and duty. James was the exact opposite of there. This relationship with my friend was based on gratitude and love. That's what God intends for us. But so many people don't understand what we're going to be talking about in the scripture today of who they are and the relationship that God intends them to have through adoption. So when we think about this, I'd like to invite you to go back to these times in your life, and we've all had them, when we did not feel wanted. It may have been in a relationship. I remember as a teenager, oh my gosh, terrified of girls and extremely interested in them. And back in the days when I was growing up, we did have telephones, but they were the old dial-up telephones. And you could dial your numbers. And back in those days, you didn't have to have an area code. That hadn't been invented yet. You just have 7 numbers here in the city of Dallas. And I dial, I get that last 7th number and just hold it and hold it and hold it and hold it. Sometimes I'd hold it so long when I let go, the call didn't go through. And sometimes I get my courage up early and let go, and I can't tell you the relief when I got thank God it's busy. And it was better when their parents answered the phone because I was real comfortable with adults. So I could be charming and nice and visit with their parents, which I always loved. And then the heart would start thumping again when they went to get them to talk to me on the phone. And sometimes I'd ask them out and they go, and sometimes they just didn't want me. We've all had those times where we don't feel wanted. A lot of people feel like their parents did not want them. A lot of people feel like somebody that was a romantic interest did not want them. If you've been married, you've all had those days where your spouse does not want you. You know what that's like. You've probably applied for a job and they didn't want you. You've probably been maybe applied for a sorority or fraternity. Sometimes we're not wanted, but I want you to know God always wants you. The sovereign God of the universe only has one child of his own. That would be Jesus, his only begotten son. All of his other children are adopted. That's the only way we come to Christ, is by adoption. So we're going to look at adoption. I want you to understand this. I want you to understand the value of having a really good father. Not everybody had a good father. I had a good father. I had a father who had a plaque on the wall that said Dad of the Year. His name was on a building in downtown Dallas, on a room that they dedicated him for his professional work in the agricultural industry. Good father. Had another friend, not such a good father. This guy was a triathloner, great athlete, pretty big guy, pretty tough guy. He was at my home one day, and sometimes God just shows up even though we're not meeting, especially to connect with God. It was not a client session. It's just a friend over, but somehow he went into regression while we were talking about his life. And he went back and he found himself. Fortunately, I knew what to do in situations like this. I don't ever intentionally do regression psychologically, but it happens sometimes. He regressed back to the womb shortly after his conception. And his biological mother and his biological father, who were not married, were sitting at a kitchen table. And his biological father said to his mother, after she said to him, I'm pregnant, he said, you've ruined my life. I don't want to be married. I don't want to be married to you. And I don't want that blankety blank, blank, blank kid. This friend, big, tough, strong man, just hysterically started sobbing because his father had not wanted him. Today, he's a different father. He knows he's adopted. He's close to God. It works like that. Let's talk about adoption for a minute. It was not a big part of the Hebrew culture, but Paul knew all about it as he writes to the church in Rome because it was a big deal in Greek culture. And most of the time when people adopted somebody, the reason they would adopt someone is because they didn't have an heir for their estate. They could adopt a baby, they could adopt a child, they could even adopt an adult. And sometimes some of them waited till people grew up to see if they were a worthy heir of their estate. It was always at great expense to the father who was doing the adopting. And when people were adopted back in this culture, and this is something Paul was very much aware of, 4 different things happened. One of the things that happened was when they were adopted, the adopting father canceled all of their debts and obligations, paid it all off, sometimes at great expense to do that. And then we come to the next thing that happened. He gave the adopted son his name, and they became part of the family. And then the third thing, the adopting father took full responsibility for anything that adopted child might do, good or bad. The father took responsibility for it. And fourth, that father had an expectation that this adopted son or daughter would honor them and try to please them. It was just part of the deal. I see so many in church that are still living under fear and duty. And God would like to shift you to love and gratitude. Jesus was always going head to head with the religious people of his day because they were all about the rules. And God was all about the relationship. They were all about the law. God was all about the love. And so hopefully you can make that transition, and this will help you as we look at adoption and what comes with all of this. There's 7 benefits that come to you as a child of God. In Romans chapter 8, we're going to look at verses 12 through 17. So then, brothers, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with Him in order that we may also be glorified with Him. So we look at this big promises. The first thing we look at, we're going to go to verse 14. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received the spirit of adoption as sons. Did you catch that? All who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. Sometimes people question their salvation. They wonder, am I a child of God? Well, here's one of the keys to it. If you're led by the Spirit of God, if God leads you, and He may lead you through a voice, it could be audible. It's not. It may be an internal voice. He can lead you through circumstances. He can lead you through dreams. He can lead you through feelings. But if the Spirit of God leads you, that's confirmation that you are a child of God. In this passage, you have two words for children. There's teknon, which is children, and there is weos, which are specifically sons. Now, culture has changed a little bit over the last 2,000 years. Back in this day, it was not offensive anybody to call all of God's people the sons of God, male and female. That would be highly offensive today because some of you identify as females. Some of you identify as males. That's a big deal. I don't understand. I don't keep up with it. I really don't care about it, but I don't want to step on anybody's gender toes. Whether you are he, she, or it, it's up to you, or we, whatever you want to be. Doesn't matter to me. But it's not offensive to the people that he was writing to call the men and the women the sons of God. So, ladies, I just don't want you to feel left out. It's just a cultural thing. But he's trying to talk about you as being the children of God. He made a distinction in John, the first chapter, that you get to be children of God. Now, every human would be the offspring of God, but children are the ones that belong to Him, that are part of the family. The first benefit we see is security. Verse 15, for you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. There's a lot packed into that. There are three benefits. There is security, there's authority, and there's intimacy just in that one sentence. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. My parents used to tell me all the time, when they would not let me do what I wanted to do with who I wanted to do with it, that they were giving me the security of limitations. Let me tell you, teenagers don't give a rip about the security of limitations. However, they were wise parents. God gives us this security by letting us know where the boundaries are. Many years ago, they did an experiment with an elementary school, which fascinated me. When they built the new school, they ran out of funds and they didn't have a fence around it immediately. So the teachers, when the children were outside, would always say, stay close to the school. So they stayed clustered really close to the building. They measured it. They wouldn't get more than 20 or 30 feet away from the building. However, when they got the funding and they put the fence up, which was far away, it was around the property line of this school, all of a sudden the children, once they had that clear, distinct boundary, moved much farther out. They had much more freedom. They had more places they could go because they had a clear boundary. God gives us clear boundaries. I didn't like this for about the 40 or first 50 years of my life. I used to read the scriptures. When you come to the Psalms and the Proverbs, David, a man after God's own heart, an enviable warrior, a king, a spectacular human being, he just go on and on. Oh, I love your law. I love your statutes. I love your decrees. I love your precepts. And I think, why do you like all these stupid rules? I didn't like the rules. I didn't recognize that. But as the years ago, that I realized the rules are helpful. They give you more freedom. So he gives us security in this. He helps us know we're secure. You have received not the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. Now, to understand this more clearly, got to understand slavery 2,000 years ago in Rome was very different from slavery in the United States of America. The slavery that we had here is African slave traders would kidnap forcibly people, put them on a ship, a slave trading ship, bring them to America, put them on the auction block, and sell them totally, completely against their will. Back in these days, you had options. If you ever got upside down financially, they didn't have bankruptcy. If you owed somebody some money and you would not or could not pay them back, they could have you put in the debtor's prison. And once you're in the debtor's prison in Rome, you don't get out until somebody has paid your debt in full. So most of the people who went to the debtor's prison died there. The option they had, if they didn't want to go to debtor's prison, is they could voluntarily become a slave. And they would work for somebody for a designated amount of time to pay off their debt. Then they'd be free to go. Slavery was voluntary. So he's saying, hey, you don't have to go back into slavery to fear anymore. You can, but you don't have to. Now, let's get down to some very basic, simple psychology. In the human experience, there are two primal emotions. One feels good, one feels bad. The Bible would call the good one love, the bad one fear. Met with a new client this week, was amazed. Uber successful guy. Started one of the top 60 businesses in the Fortune 500. I mean, he's doing well. International business magnate. Phenomenal, wonderful guy. But he realized his whole life up until Monday had been driven by fear. My whole life was driven by fear. Even as somebody who learned to say mommy, daddy, and Jesus about the same time, growing up in a Christian home, being on church staffs, serving God full time, I still was driven by fear. Fear that I wouldn't be good enough. Fear that people wouldn't like me. Fear that people would not want me. Fear that I would not be good enough. This culture, this society is eaten up with that. Even people who the Lord, you don't have to be driven by fear. You can be led by love. I like to default oftentimes to M. Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled. I love his definition of love. I wondered about it when I heard it the first time. I thought, sounds a little bit self-centered and selfish to me. As I've studied it over the years, I agree wholeheartedly. He said, love is the will to extend one's self for the nurturing of one's own or another's spiritual growth. So when you're led by love, you're constantly trying to grow spiritually. Now, there's a difference when you're trying to grow spiritually and you feel like a servant or a slave, and when you feel like a child. You know, my parents always encouraged me to learn. But if you have a job in a business, you probably don't want people sitting around studying and learning on your clock. You want them to work. So we don't have to go back. This is why we have security, that we don't have to go back to a life of fear. If you haven't made that transition, please start. Most of the time, it takes a while. I've been working on it for years. There's much less fear. I say no to a lot more than I used to. You ever do stuff you just don't want to do because you're afraid of what people think if you don't do it? I used to do most of what I did was what other people I thought would approve of. Now, more and more, I'm picking to do what I absolutely love and choose to do. It's a much better way of life. So he gives us security and he gives us authority. My parents were good about giving me authority. I was born in Oak Cliff, little house on Shadowwood, 2-bedroom, 1 bath. Had one of those cool floor furnaces. Remember those? That was great until your pet turtle would fall off. We had several fried turtles because they got off in the floor furnace, but it was just cool for a kid growing up. And they said, okay, this is your room. What color would you like it? They started teaching me how to make decisions early on. I want it bright green. So we went to paint shop, looked at some swatches, picked out the brightest, most bold, ugly, horrible, gaudy green. It looked the best in pitch dark when the lights were totally out. But painted it there. And then they came out with new kinds of spray paints. Those small little cans said glows in the dark. Had to have some of that. And it came in green and pink and orange and yellow. So I got some green. I thought, green room, green spray can, this is cool. So being the bright, creative young 4-year-old I took the spray paint, and since it was going to glow in the dark and it was green, I didn't think it'd show in the daytime. So I just put a great big circle all the way around my light switch and around my door, outlined it all. And mom and dad came in. It was not the same color green at all. It looked like graffiti had started in my room. But they looked at it, they looked at each other and said, that's your room. You get to live with it. So that's authority. God gives you authority as his children. You're part of the family. Your voice counts. He cares about that. The third thing in this voice is intimacy. Doesn't mean much to us. It said, in whom we cry, Abba, Father. Abba is a term of endearment. Our best translation today would be daddy. However, that was unacceptable. You remember how Jesus always was butting heads with the established religious community, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. They hated him. They hated him. They wanted to kill him. This is one of the big reasons. You realize Jesus was the first person in the Bible that used a term of endearment for his heavenly Father, called him daddy. The Jewish people, out of respect for God, would not pronounce the name of God. You'll still see some of them, even when they write God, it would be G-D. They leave a letter out because of respect. So they thought this was irreverent. They thought this was reckless. They thought this was totally unacceptable. But he had that kind of relationship, that kind of intimacy. Now you go back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve separated themselves from God when they sinned. Sin does that to us. It diminishes the intimacy. It happens in marriages. If there's sin, it diminishes the intimacy. Now think about this. God knows everything. He knows your thoughts. He knows what you've done. He knows who you did it with, how many times you did it, how bad it was. He covered that in advance. Before he created you, he knew what you would do. Jesus covered it all. That's why it's so important to realize that you can have intimacy with God based on the righteousness and the performance of Jesus rather than your own. You live in a very performance-based society. You're going to be judged by how you look, by how much you weigh, by what kind of shape you're in, by how much money you have, by how much education you have, by your performance. Can you do the job? Can you get it done? If your children embarrass you and don't do well, you're going to be judged by most of the culture. You didn't perform well enough. It's your fault. God's not looking at you that way. When he looks at you, he sees the righteousness of Christ. That was justification. That was a legal declaration where God imparted to you, declared you righteous. So he's going to love you the same regardless of your performance. I do not want to show of hands, but I wonder how many of you really believe that. I wonder how many of you really believe if I just make the worst mistake of my life today, will I still feel as close to God, or will I let my mistake destroy my intimacy with him? He doesn't want you running away. We've got the picture of the father of the prodigal son. The son broke the intimacy with the father. He took his inheritance and he left. He squandered it all. His performance was absolutely deplorable. He gives perfect definition to what President Trump called deplorable. You see him, he does everything wrong. And yet, when he comes back to the father, he's dragging. He's going over what he's going to say. I don't deserve to be your child. I don't deserve to be your son. Just let me be one of your servants. Just let me eat what you feed to the animals. It's so much better than what I had before. Let me come back and just be a slave. And he's trudging. He's moving slowly. His head's down. When the father sees him in the distance moving toward him, the father pulls up his robe, runs toward him, embraces him. Not a word of "I told you so," "You should have known better," "How are you going to pay it back?" "How are you going to make it up?" "What are you going to do to make restitution for me and your brother and the family and everybody else?" None of that. Total, complete, pure love. Embraced him. Basically said to the other elders at the gate, if you're going to stone my son to death, which is what he deserves by law, you're going to have to kill me first. He put his robe on his shoulder. He covered him. Put his sandals on his feet. Put his ring on his finger, giving him authority, the authority of the family. Every single time we turn back to God and lean toward him, he starts to run for us. That's the intimacy we have for him. Now, Satan will lie to you about this. John 8:44b, he's the liar. He's the father of all lies. He's constantly trying to tell you God's love for you is based on your performance. God's love is like humans' love. If you perform, he will love you. If you don't, he'll love you less. It's not true. His love doesn't change. It never fails. That's how much God loves you. The next benefit we see here is assurance. Verse 16, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. I wish I could explain that to you thoroughly. I can't. How does God's Spirit bear witness? These are judicial terms. To bear witness is to give testimony. If somebody comes into a court of law to testify, they take an oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help them God. So this is the truth. The Spirit under oath, telling only the truth, is going to bear witness with your spirit. Lots of people are not really in touch with their spirit. I remember the day and the situation when I came in touch with my spirit. Quick lesson in humanity. You are a spirit, you have a soul, and you live in a body. Your spirit has three functions. It's your conscience. That tells you the difference between right and wrong. You can sear or you can harden your conscience, your hearts. It's also your communion with God. It's the receiver. I think everybody in this room, except one person, probably has a cell phone today. And that's the receiver. And you can take calls on your receiving unit. But if you don't have that receiving unit with you, nobody can call you. You have to have the receiver. Your human spirit is the spiritual receiver for the Spirit of God. And it's your intuition. Intuition is when you know things that do not come to you through your five senses. So I had just been to a deliverance conference, which I didn't know about. Wasn't even sure I was going to stay for the ministry time. They cast a bunch of demons out of me. And I woke up the next day a different human being. I was shocked what a difference it made. I woke up, I was thinking about my day. It was on a Sunday, been to this conference on Friday and Saturday. I woke up Sunday morning, the day after the conference, and I was thinking about my day, and there was a song in my heart, and it's like, whoa. I'm thinking in my head, in my spirit, there's a song. I mean, it's like worship music. It's kind of songs we were singing at church. There were music, and I could hear the guitar and the drums and the bass and the singers and the words, but it was not in my head. It's in my heart. And I thought, whoa, this is a big shift. That was the first time I knew, recognized, experienced the difference between my head and my heart. Years ago, when I was just learning about some of the things of the Spirit, I had a friend. He was like fifth generation Pentecostal preacher. And I'd been visiting his church. And I asked him out to lunch one day. This was when I was first getting to know this guy, and said, hey, I don't understand any of this crazy stuff that's going up. I mean, this was one of those Pentecostal, they were running up and down the aisles. I didn't understand that. It looked like a rock concert. They were having so much fun and so happy in church. I sure didn't understand that. And I'd watch this guy, and he'd go through an audience and prophesy to people. I said, how do you do that? He said, well, I just feel it in my spirit, and then I just tell people what I feel in my spirit. And so, how do you do that? And I just drill this poor guy. He finally says, I look over the crowd and I'll see somebody and I'll just feel love for them. And when I feel that love, I'll center in on them, and then I'll ask God, you got something? He said, it's an act of faith, because sometimes I'll just have people stand up, and all I know is I felt the love of God for them. I have no idea what I'm going to say, but when I take that step of faith and have somebody stand up, God then gives me more for them. And that's knowing the difference between your head and your heart. That's the difference between knowing the difference between your soul and your spirit. This is Hebrews 4:12. The word of God is living and active, sharper than a double-edged sword, penetrating to dividing bone and marrow, soul and spirit. So I used to look at that and think that's weird. But think about that. This is just God 2,000 years ago. Why would he talk about dividing bone and marrow? He knew about 1,800 years later, we'd start studying and learning about bone marrow transplants. You separate the marrow from the bone. Why do you need to separate soul from spirit? Soul, my mind, my will, my emotions, spirit. Different. Is this my mind, or is this the Holy Spirit giving me something for somebody? I'm so excited. 2 weeks ago, somebody showed up I didn't know at all on a Wednesday night. Had no idea who this young lady was. All I had was a first name and probably a middle name. Maybe it was her last name. I don't know. Never seen her before. Didn't know whose friend she was. Didn't know how she got there. During the worship time, I was looking at the people on Zoom saying, God, you got anything for these people? Got anything for her? And God said, he said, yeah, healing. I heard healing. Okay. What about healing? Didn't get anything else. It's like, God, is it for her? Is she going to heal somebody? Is she going to get healed? What is it? He didn't tell me. I said, what do you want me to do? Just tell her what you got. Tell her it's going to be good either way. Okay. So I called her by name and said, I felt like the Lord said, he's doing something with healing in your life. I don't know if you're going to heal somebody else or you're going to receive a healing, but you're going to win either way. If you get healed, you win. If you heal somebody else, you win, because you're going to reap what you sow. It's going to come back to you. You're going to win either way, and moved on to the next person. I just discovered that little thing. It's called chat on Zoom. Y'all are probably more technologically advanced than I am. And I saw this little thing that at the bottom of my screen that said chat lighted up in a number 1. So I clicked on it. It was her. And she sent me a message and said, thank you so much. I want more than anything else to be able to lay my hands on people and have them healed. And I thought, go God. I heard it right. It's just neat. That's how it is when his spirit testifies with our spirit. This is how you figure things out. Dr. John Wallace is a close friend. He was my pastor many years ago. We've been friends for close to 30 years now. And he's such an effect on my life. Well, he and his wife have been praying about moving to the hill country because they have 3 children. One is retiring from the military after 20 years of distinguished service and after 4 more years of West Point. He's already bought a house in the hill country. All three of their children live within 35 minutes of each other. And he's got a daughter who's a school teacher in Wimberley. The other one lives in Austin. And they've been praying about moving to be close to their children. They're in their 70s now, so they like to be close to family. And his wife was saying, is this a good idea or is this a God idea? And she was going to Joshua. She was looking for something in particular, but she ran across the story of Rahab the harlot. And about the second, Rahab told the people, guess what? Go to the hill country. How is that for confirmation? So they've announced they're out of here. That's how clear God is. And that was God speaking through his word to her spirit. And she knew. I remember years ago, I was under some pressure. I was about 28 to go to seminary. They said, you need to go to seminary. You should go to seminary. And I thought, I'm doing pretty darn good without seminary. I'd already been the top 2% of the biggest Baptist churches in the world. And I thought, I'm doing good. I'm all right here. But wise people keep saying you need to go to seminary. And so I've been praying about it reluctantly because I was sickened. I never liked school. I was reading one day and it said in the Proverbs, get knowledge, get understanding, even if it costs you all you have. Boom. God's spirit to my spirit, you have to go to seminary. So packed up and started the next fall. And kept going and going and going and going and going. And it was just, that's how he speaks, spirit to spirit. Verse 16, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs. So you get the assurance from the Spirit, and then you get an inheritance. In Colossians, it talks about Jesus. With Jesus, all things were created for him and by him, and through him, all things hold together. The universe holds together. The planet holds together. Your body holds together because of Jesus. Lynn McTaggart wrote a really good book called The Field and talked about there's just this force out there. It's everywhere. It's energetic. You can't get away from it. And some people equate that to Jesus. Where is he today? He's seated at the right hand of the throne of God, but he's everywhere. And he's holding all things together. So you got this inheritance with him who owns it all. You have been made a joint heir. You've been written into the will. Not only he's not going to die, you get it now. You own everything with God. And I'll look at how Jesus lived. He was not a hoarder. He traveled light, but he always had everything he possibly needed. Everything. When he was at a wedding and they ran out of wine, his mother said, do whatever he says, do. He said, bring me some jugs of water. And he converted it into wine. And it was the best wine they'd ever had. And then when people had been with him for 3 days and had nothing to eat, and he told his disciples, feed the people. And he said, no, we don't have enough food. Let them go. Send them away. They need to go eat somewhere else. He said, well, what do you have? Well, there's one little boy who's got 2 fishes and 5 loaves. He blessed it, multiplied it, and had plenty left over. When he needed to get from the shore on the Sea of Galilee out to the boat where his disciples were, I guess he was running a little bit late that day. He didn't have a boat. He walked on the water. He always had what he needed. I know a lot of you in this room, a lot of you have had some really tough times. But when we look back, if you're here now, you made it through those tough times. You're still standing. You're still here today. That's because he continued to give you all that you needed. So we have this inheritance. We own it all with him. We have family likenesses. You're like Jesus. You have the mind of Christ. You have the Spirit of God. Those are attributes of God. You've got those characteristics. And then discipline. We can spend all next week talking about suffering, but it said, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. Have you ever noticed that families suffer together? They go through times of lack, they go through times of abundance. There's fellowship in suffering, and God will discipline us. I'm going to wrap it up today with two stories and a quote by Dr. Ken Keller. But I first want to go to Ezekiel chapter 36. This is what God said he'd do a long time before Jesus came along. Verse 26, 26. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and to be careful to obey my rules. You shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I shall be your God. Dr. Paul Pearsall was a psychoneuroimmunologist. He was Polynesian, had an interesting perspective on life, and most of his life he worked with transplant patients. He did research. One day he was in Houston doing a seminar with a bunch of professionals down there. He had medical doctors, he had psychiatrists, psychologists, professional counselors, people in the people helping industries. He had a question and answer time. He had a couple microphones set up out where the audience could easily get to them in the aisles. People lined up to ask their questions. He comes to one lady. She starts to talk. She begins to weep. She's emotionally overwhelmed. She finally is able to get her story out that she's a psychiatrist. She had a new patient who was 8 years old. This patient had had a heart transplant, and the surgery went so well for her. There was no rejection. There were no problems. Her heartbeat was regular. Her body received it, and physically all was well. They had some question, though, that maybe the anesthesia that had lasted so long had messed up her psyche. And so they were concerned for her, and they brought her to the psychiatrist because she'd been having some really bad nightmares. And they wanted the psychiatrist to help her. Well, she listened to the nightmares. What happened often with these was she would have this dream about a man abducting her, taking to her house, sexually assaulting her, and brutally murdering her. And she'd dream it again and again and again. The psychiatrist couldn't do anything about it. So she finally called in the police. And they came in with one of their sketch artists. They asked this little girl, would you help us draw a picture of the house? And they did. And they said, would you help us draw a picture of the man? And they did. Ultimately, the police went to a house that looked like the one in the picture. They knocked on the door. A man opened the door who looked like the person that they'd drawn a picture of. And he ultimately confessed to kidnapping a 10-year-old girl, sexually assaulting her and brutally murdering her. And she had been the donor. The 10-year-old was the donor for the 8-year-old's new heart. 3,000 years ago, Scripture said, as a man thinketh in his heart, so he is. We got so smart in the last 200 years that we thought we only think with our brains. No, you also think with your hearts, you think with your guts. You've got neuropeptides that carry emotional memory. So when she got a new body part, she got new memories. There was a lady named Claire Sylvia, who was the first heart and lung transplant patient in all of New England. After this spectacular surgery she was 47 years old. A reporter was interviewing her one day and said, hey, when you first woke up after the surgery, what were you thinking about? And she said, I can't really tell you what I was thinking about, but gosh, I just wanted a cold beer so bad. She said, the strange thing is I'm not a beer drinker. I don't like beer. I don't like the smell of it. I don't drink it. I'm not used to it. And as I went along, I realized I had cravings for things that I'd never craved before, like Snickers and chocolate bars. And the strangest thing is McDonald's chicken McNuggets. I just dying for them. And she also started having dreams. She started dreaming about a young man who was tall and slender, and he'd show up in her dreams. And she had a sense his name was Tim, and then she had a sense his name was Tim L. Didn't know what that was about. They weren't bad dreams at all. And she got curious a few months after her surgery when she was getting her strength back. She really wanted to know who her donor had been. They wouldn't tell her at the hospital. So she started looking around in her area. She went back and started studying the obituaries of people who had died on the day she got her heart, or maybe the day before at the most. And she ran across somebody, Tim Lamondiadra, something like that, Tim L. And she found his parents. In the obituary, it said he'd been killed in a motorcycle accident. He was 18 years old. She met the parents. They showed him a picture of Tim, same man in her dreams. She saw him. She described these foods, the Snickers, the chocolate bars, the green peppers that she really wanted, and the chicken McNuggets. And they said, after the wreck, the medical people trying to save his life ripped his clothes off of him, and they found in his jacket pocket, he had a little bag of chicken McNuggets in his pocket. So when you receive a body part from another human being, your desires change, your preferences change, your thoughts and feelings change. You have received the Spirit of God that changes you. That's something you will begin to develop more and more desire for the things of God and less desire for things of the flesh. And now, to quote Dr. Timothy Keller, he talks about, we'll wrap it up with this, the difference between a son and a slave. He said a slave obeys under compulsion because they have to. A son obeys out of love and joy for daddy. A slave works under threat of pain or loss. Punishment pays back. A son is disciplined, but it's not retribution, but loving instruction. For a slave, they have insecurity. If I slip up, my master might beat me. But for a son, he has security. If I slip up, my father will forgive me. For a slave, they have to concentrate on external behavior and compliance with the rules. But for a son, concentration on relationship and attitudes. The slave has to work, but is given no honor. The son is honored and invited to join the work. Are you living? Are you thinking? Are you feeling? Are you acting like a slave or a son?